Hi, everybody. We are live streaming this event today, so we do have to try and stay on time as best we can. I'm Brian O'Rourke, the President and Chief Executive Officer of CADTH, and I'd like to welcome you all to this drug portfolio information session. Let me start by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So, this afternoon we've got a lot of presentations to go through this afternoon. Brent Fraser and his team, as well as Nicole Mittman, lots of information that we want to share on our proposed alignment between CADTH's two drug review programs, and then a number of new initiatives. We'll talk a little bit about our scientific advice program, patient engagement, one of our most important initiatives, and how we're advancing that. And I do want to save a good 30 minutes or so for questions at the end. I will, after the groups of presentations, I'll open it up for burning questions, real burning questions, just to clarify issues. But just to allow us to stay on time, we'll probably move directly from presentation to presentation and then get to the questions at the end. For the questions, those of you online, just look for the question icon on the toolbar, and you can submit those questions at any time. And I'll probably alternate from questions in the room and questions online. Those of you in the room, you'll see some microphones here. Try and make your way to the microphone and let me know who you are and who you're representing, and then pose your question. So you are going to hear today from myself, from Brent, from Trevor Richter, Director of our Pharmaceutical Reviews program, from Heather, a Senior Advisor in our Pharmaceutical Reviews program, and Nicole Mittman. As I mentioned about the questions, and one of the first things I wanted to mention, some of you probably have heard that I've announced my retirement from CADTH effective the end of March of 2020. Our CADTH board chair and the board of directors has created a succession plan. They are engaged with a headhunter company by the name of Boyden, executive search firm, and their hope is to, and their goal is more than a hope, their goal is to have my successor in place before I leave on March 31st. By the way, if any of you are interested, go to the Boyden website or the CADTH website, and you'll get all of the information that you require. The other big news, of course, is last week we heard from our Prime Minister following the election. He announced his new cabinet. Patty Hajdu, Honourable Patty Hajdu, has been named as the Minister of Health for Canada. And Navdeep Bains will remain in his position, but under a new title of Innovation, Science and Industry. So both portfolios quite interested to the people who would participate in this type of an event. We're all eagerly awaiting the mandate letters for the ministers so we can get a better impression of their priorities moving forward on things such as pharmacare, the Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy Table, and whatever else might be their priorities in healthcare. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the international initiatives underway in the pharmaceutical space. We maintain a good connectivity with a lot of the international groups. I just got back from a very important international meeting on cancer combinations. What I've put up here is a top 10 list. ISPOR, the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research, is now putting out an annual top 10 list from all of their members from around the world. And you can see for a number of years now, drug spending and pricing is still the #1 priority. Lots of things on real-world evidence, aging populations, pricing transparency, value assessment frameworks, that's what they call them in the US as opposed to HTA, personalized precision medicine, and lots of other interesting topics. Some of the other key areas that we've been engaged with in NATA, which is the International Network of Agencies for Health Technology Assessment. I served as their board chair for about 4 years. and Michelle Majumdar from CADTH is currently on their board of directors. This is 50 agencies representing about 30 different countries from around the world. Great opportunity for networking and common priorities. A few things that we're working on now. We have been leading, again, a global initiative to come up with a revised and consolidated definition for health technology assessment. I've been co-leading that group, and we are very close to having a final definition, something that will actually be able to understand and to be a little bit more memorable. There's currently 9 different definitions out there. Most of them are about a half a page long and use a lot of technical jargon in them. So we've been trying to put something together that's a little more coherent and easy to understand and translatable into many different languages. There's also been a global collaborative, and this is from HTA groups around the world on real-world evidence. Trying to get a little bit of coherence in the methods we use, the type of data that we will collect, and how we will apply real-world evidence to our initial assessments and to any reassessments that we would do in the post-market space. And then the other major initiative that we've been doing, HTA has typically been focused on supporting policy decision-making, and the Guidelines International Network, or GIN, has been more focused on using evidence at that clinician-patient interface in the clinical practice guidelines. These are two groups that traditionally have not really talked well together. And once again here, we've been working very closely. INATA and GIN have come together with a common working group that we've referred to as GINATA to try and ensure that we have similar evidence that's used for policy decision-making as well as in clinical practice guidelines. Health Technology Assessment International, which is the international society for HTA, their annual conference in 2020 will be in Beijing. That's unfortunately going to restrict many Canadians from going just because of some of the diplomatic issues we're currently having with China. Nobody from CADTH will be going. The Institute of Health Economics in Alberta, same process that they've concerned about sending people to Beijing. Having said that, however, there is a group within HTAI called the Global Policy Forum, which is an equal number of companies, medical device and pharmaceutical companies, and representatives from HTA agencies who get together usually twice per year, focused on one major topic each year to try and come out with a common approach to how we would deal with that. The topic coming up in 2020, and the meeting will be held at the end of January, to me is one of the most important that we've had in a number of years on the deliberative frameworks. Once again here, trying to put some good theory and evidence behind how committees, whether it's called an appraisal committee or an expert committee as we have at CADTH, how they actually deliberate to make good decisions. And Nicole's going to speak a little bit to that. The Center for Innovation in Regulatory Sciences is a very interesting group. It was created some 25 years ago by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Stuart Walker, who had lots of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, but he felt the need to bring together regulators from around the world, Food and Drug Administration, European Medicines Agency, Japan, Canada, etc., to do benchmarking and to try and put some common methods and processes together amongst the regulators. So it was a great way for industry and regulators to meet together and to address some of these key issues and challenges. About 10 years ago, they created an HTA arm, and I'm currently chairing their steering committee on the HTA side. We held a meeting just this fall focused on uncertainty, and it brought together industry representatives, patients, members from the regulatory community and the HTA community to have this discussion about the uncertainty in product development, in the regulatory decision-making, in the HTA, and as it gets to patients. And is there a way that we can, in the clinical development stage, really early post-market, trying to address some of that uncertainty before we go through the entire product development, regulatory cycle, and reimbursement cycle. So we're hoping for some good work coming out of that. Through ISPOR, ISPOR has created an HTA council, and I've just taken over in July as the chair of that HTA council. ISPOR has been putting a lot more focus outside of just the health economics component and outcomes research component of pharmaceutical and medical device portfolios to focus in on HTA. They have been able to create these HTA roundtables, and these happen in every part of the world. There's an Asia-Pacific roundtable, a Latin American roundtable, Middle East roundtable in Africa, as well as North American and Europe roundtables. I participated in 2 of them this year. A lot of focus on some of the new innovation, new challenges that are facing HTA agencies around the world, some of the curative therapies. A big issue that is being addressed by a number of the agencies is on budget impact, but not just on the budget impact of a particular drug, but on the cumulative budget impact on treating a particular disease state. Lots of talk about stakeholder engagement, particularly how agencies engage patients. ISPOR also has a patients council and a patient roundtable as well that they hold in these different areas. And then I mentioned I just participated in this meeting on cancer combination therapies. What was the genesis for this? And there was a number of companies, probably represented companies from here, global offices from Janssen, from Pfizer, from Amgen, and from Roche, felt a need to come together in the oncology space where a backbone therapy that has been approved maybe a year ago, 5 years ago, still is the standard of care, but then a new a new drug comes in and is used in combination with that backbone therapy. The backbone therapy, however, is already reaching the maximum level of budget impact or willingness to pay, cost effectiveness, and there's no room left for the combination therapy. It's creating a significant challenge in many countries and in many of the companies involved. So this was a way to come together to talk about how we might be dealing with some of these cancer combination therapies. And then lastly, this collaboration between one of the few true HTA agencies in the United States, ICER, with NICE in the UK and CADTH. And we've been specifically focused on the value component of and the health economics component of some of these new curative therapies, the single-use therapies. So lots of work happening in there, and we'll be coming out very soon, I believe, with the results of that collaboration. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Brent now, but just before I do, one of the things that you're going to hear a fair bit about is the alignment work that's underway between PCoder and CDR at CADTH. Now, much of the work associated with this alignment is driven by internal efficiencies within CADTH. When we brought PCoder into CADTH 5 years ago, we were still using the platform, the IT component from the Canadian Partnerships Against Cancer, where the housing for PCoder was. So lots of efficiencies, lots of internal things that we're trying to do from an administrative perspective, from a technology perspective, conflict of interest declarations, the look and feel of the documents that we use, as well as just the document management in those 2 programs. But having said that, I've been hearing lately lots of rumors, lots of misinformation, and lots of rhetoric about this alignment. And I just want to upfront address a couple of issues. Number one is, and I'll be very clear about this, we are not getting rid of PERC, the PCoder Expert Review Committee. Again, that's a piece of information that I've heard. We're retaining both CDEC for CDR and PERC. The volume of submissions we get and just the expertise that we have on each of those committees has been paramount. And secondly, we are not simply taking the CDR process and applying it to PCoder. This is an opportunity for us to look at the best practices of both of those programs, as well as looking at best practices from drug review programs around the world, and to try and once again create a common look and feel for those 2 programs. So you're going to hear a lot about some of the processes and the alignment work that's happening there. And we're still in the consultative phase. I've asked Brent and Trevor to have the new process up and ready to go on the 1st of April of next year. So there's still some consultation, still some work involved to do there. But most importantly, we're not getting rid of PERC, and this isn't just taking CDR and plunking it into PCoder. There's a number of things we're doing as well within that to try and enhance the engagement of patients and other key stakeholders in both of those programs as well. So with that as the background, I'm now going to turn it over to Brent to start leading you in the update in the Pharmaceutical Reviews.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I'm going to start off the discussion talking about the alignment work that we are doing. And as Brian mentioned, this is not a takeover of one process over another. So it's not PCoder taking over CDR or vice versa. What we're really trying to do is establish a single review process for any drug product that comes into CADTH for review. And right now, the reason we're doing this is if we tend to see a spike in one program and not in another, it's challenging for us to move resources from one team to the next. There are some corporate resources that we can't take advantage of because we're using different systems for PCoder. We're using slightly different processes within the PCoder reviews compared to CDR. So a lot of this work that we're undertaking right now is looking at what is the best practices from the PCoder team or review process, and what are the best practices from the CDR process. And hopefully in between those two states, we'll have one single drug review process that takes advantage of the best of two programs. So we're looking at this from the perspective of increasing transparency as much as possible, increasing efficiency internally as well as externally in how we engage some of our stakeholders, ensuring that these reviews are done in a timely manner so we are not changing our review timelines through any of this work. And we need to make sure that this is sustainable. We've had some situations in the last year where we've had some very high peaks. We had major resource constraints, and we want to be able to manage that a little bit more effectively going forward. So what's taken so long? Since I've been in this position, I've mentioned numerous times that we would be aligning the two processes. But I think it's to recognize that even though the review processes are similar to one another, they're different enough that it makes it difficult to just merge the two together into one review program. So that's taken a little bit of work, or a lot of work actually. Even just doing policies and procedures, that's a huge amount of work that needs to be completed in order for us to move forward. One of the other barriers, as Brian mentioned, is our IT infrastructures. It's a little bit different for what we had with PCoder compared to what we've used for all of our other CADTH products. So we have to make sure that the IT systems are set up such that it can support both of our reviews. And I think the other fact is that things have been extremely busy right now. So we're trying to implement change on top of a very heavy workload. So as you can imagine, for staff, that can be very concerning. We have to make sure that we're not moving so quickly that we're forgetting about the impact on the teams. But we also have to move at a pace that gets to that April 1st date so that we're not continually talking about this in a year from now. So one of the things is around patient engagement, and what we're looking at is having an opportunity for patient groups to comment on all of our reviews. So right now, patient groups do not comment on our CDR recommendations when they come out. We will be looking at having them being able to comment on the CDR reviews, so that's consistent with PCoder. We're also increasing the window for patient groups to respond or make submissions into supporting the review programs up to 35 days. We have a patient engagement team, which Nicole will probably talk about a little bit more detail at the end of the presentation, but we'll be using them as our primary point of contact for all patient engagement activities. So any of the disease groups or advocacy groups can work through that patient engagement team moving forward. And we'll also look at an opportunity for the patient groups to liaise directly with CADTH staff, and that would primarily be through the patient engagement team as well. We're also looking to harmonize our conflict of interest processes. So they're different between the groups, whether it's a PCoder review versus a CDR review. And it's important that we have one conflict of interest process that applies to all of the work that we do within the pharmaceutical review team. Manufacturers, we're using the word sponsor now. It was just an easy word for us to use. That's consistent in our policy and procedures. There was a lot of debate over that one word, but you are now sponsors. And you'll have the opportunity as well to review the draft reports ahead of those going to our committee meetings. So we think that this will give you an opportunity to correct any factual errors or misinterpretations of some of the evidence that has been provided to us ahead of it going to the committee. One of the things which I know some people have raised some concerns about is we're looking at removing the checkpoint meetings from the PCoder process. But the offset of that is we're looking at having more interaction with manufacturers and sponsors to support our review process. And we'll also be looking at lengthening our reconsideration meetings, and potentially, we're still talking about this with our committee members, but having them potentially join in with some of the conversations with yourselves so you can hear directly from them what the concerns were that were raised during the review. The other issue that we're looking at is potentially improving our pre-submission meetings. So I think as we're implementing a number of the changes we did with the consultations earlier this year, we do recognize that probably the pre-submission meetings are going to become more important over time to make sure that manufacturers know how to pull the information together to support the review. And we're looking at developing a more structured approach to some of our pre-submission meetings and identifying the information needs for the review. And there may be some other stakeholders that are included in those pre-submission meetings as well. So the recommendations, we've done a lot of work on the recommendations over a number of years, and we introduced a harmonized process in April 2016. So the recommendation framework is the same, but the documents that we use to support that framework are different. If you just look at the look and feel between a PCoder review and a CDR review, they're different. They contain similar pieces of information, but they're just presented slightly differently. So we will be looking at developing a common format. That makes it easier for our publishing team within the program, particularly when they're supporting two review committee recommendations and posting that on our website. And as always, we are looking at having our committees look at pre-NOC submissions. We do encourage people to submit as quickly as possible. And Trevor will talk a little bit more about the aligned review process that we have with Health Canada, which I think a number of you are already familiar with. The reconsideration process, so about 20% of the files that go through CDR come back as a reconsideration, whereas in PCoder, that's 70 to 80%, and that's often because we do an initial recommendation, we allow for certain groups to comment back on that recommendation, and in the majority of the cases, those then go back to the subsequent meeting at PERC for further deliberations on some of the comments that were provided. And so we're looking at and recognizing that it does add a little bit more work to the review process. We're looking at potentially extending that for all of our reviews. We're also looking at introducing a second feedback period. So for example, if there was a positive recommendation for a particular drug and it changed to a negative recommendation or vice versa, which happens very infrequently, if it's a significant change, right now the manufacturer has no ability to comment on that final recommendation. So we are looking at allowing for, in those limited circumstances, the sponsor can provide further feedback to the review for consideration. some minor things. We're looking at aligning our feedback templates so that you can now fill up 10 pages as opposed to 3 pages, which many of you do now anyway. And we're looking at some of the requests that we receive from sponsors about potentially expanding the period for feedback. And so we're looking at whether there's some certain circumstances that could be allowed to support those types of requests. So as with all of our major changes within our review programs, we will go through a consultation period. It's still being finalized. Trevor and his team has done a lot of work on this. Once we're ready to provide more details out to all of yourselves, we will be allowing for further consultation on our proposed changes. We will also be having discussions with our customers. So the Pharmaceutical Advisory Committee is a new committee, which is an amalgamation of the 2 strategic committees within CDR and PCoder, DPAC and PAC as they were often referred to. So we'll be vetting a lot of these changes with them to make sure that they're comfortable with the approach. And once we have all of this information together, we'll be taking it out for broader external consultations. Recognizing that April 1st is the date that we're all working towards, we have to make sure that the consultation does not have a significant impact on those implementation dates. And then hopefully we'll get to the point where we will be launching one single review process. So it shouldn't make a difference to you whether you're submitting to PCoder or CDR. It'll be one common point of entry, and we will triage internally where those reviews should be going. I just wanted to highlight just a couple things around clinician engagement. As many of you know, with our review programs, but also with our optimal use program, where we tend to take a wider approach to a category of drugs, we do extensively engage clinicians during those reviews. Often, depending on what the topic is, we may have one or more clinicians involved in the review to help provide us with information around how a particular disease is managed, how this new treatment may actually impact the current standards of care, and typically looking for information such as what are the outcomes that are most clinically relevant when we're reviewing these drugs. But we also include them in all phases of our review process. So they can help us with some of the development of our protocols that we use for our optimal use projects, as an example. They do help with some of the critical appraisal work that we do in interpreting the outcomes within those studies to make sure that they're clinically meaningful. And I think I've touched on most of the other points here. When we select our experts, obviously expertise is the key area. We do like to have physicians who have had experience with the drug that we are talking about. That's not always the case, particularly in more rare conditions. But even though the experts themselves might be a little bit conflicted, we try to manage that as much as we can. And that's why we may have more than one clinician on a file as well to help balance out any potential conflicts. Obviously, they need to be responsive to our timelines because we are committed to reviewing within our period, 180 days. I just lost the number. 180 days. And then we also try to get regional representation as much as possible. Just my last slide is also just talking about how we interact with the NES when it comes to clinician engagement. So one of the things that we've recognized is that we are often going after the same experts, particularly for more rare conditions. And so CADTH would be approaching an expert to find out that a NES has already engaged that individual and vice versa. And so we're working with a NES to basically, for certain drugs, come together and engage clinicians on the same file. So we'll work together, ask them questions, and then once that work is complete, we will then proceed with our individual reviews. We are looking at having a more clinician engagement in our reviews as much as possible. And there is some work that's happening within the organization to support that. Our preference is to engage clinician groups as opposed to individual clinicians, primarily because they can provide us with a broader input into the questions that we're dealing with. And this is focused more on clinicians that want to feed into our reviews. If it's one individual, we don't know whether they're representing an organization or if they're representing their own opinions. And we've had a couple files recently where the questions came up at our expert committee as to who this person is actually representing. So similar to the patient engagement file, we will be trying to have individual clinicians, if they want to provide feedback or input into our reviews, that they work through their associations as much as possible and provide us with a common feedback and input into our reviews. And that builds off a lot of the lessons that we've gained through PCoder and their work through the clinician input process as well. So I will stop there and I'll pass it on. How do you want to do questions now? Or?
No.
Okay.
We'll just keep going.
Trevor?
Thanks, Brent. So I've tried to limit the number of times I'll use the word alignment. I'm actually thinking of setting up a swear jar in the office where every time you say alignment, you have to put in $1. We make a lot of money.
For my retirement fund.
So I'll start off with some drug program updates. So first of all, the committees. As usual, we went through an annual nomination process back in the fall of last year and managed to elect 2 new members, one for CDAC and one for PERC. And we'd like to thank Dr. Peter Jameson and Matthew Chung and Henry Conter for their contributions to CDAC and PERC respectively. And the new members are Dr. Daniel Raza for CDAC and Michael Crump for PERC. These are the full committees that are in place right now, and the chairs for CDAC and PERC, Jim Silvius and Maureen Trudeau, are continuing. Brent mentioned a new advisory committee that we have, so we decided to, for the sake of efficiency and in the spirit of alignment, merge the 2 advisory committees that were in place for oncology on the one side and CDR or everything else on the other side. These were the PAC and DPAC committees. We merged them into a single entity, which will include representation across the board from the individual committees. So that's for the drug programs that we serve, cancer agencies, various federal departments that we serve, as well as PCPA and a number of other stakeholders. I believe the inaugural meeting is this week. We also have a new working group. This is a little bit into the weeds, but for those of you who are familiar with the structure of the advisory committee, there are working groups. We did decide to change the main working group for the non-oncology side, which was involved in supporting optimal use work, to refocus their mandate more directly on policy-related issues, and that's been in place for about 10 months now. And it's, instead of the optimal use working group, that's been retired and it's been replaced by the FWG HDA working group. So we usually like to present some statistics. So these are the program numbers for PCoder and CDR for the last 8 years or so. I think it's pretty obvious that there's a steady uptrend in the number of submissions for the oncology side. CDR has been relatively stable, and just to point out that these numbers are current for 2019. They don't include any forecasting, so we might actually exceed last year's total for the combined oncology and non-oncology programs. So this is the pre-NOC submissions, so submissions that we've received prior to an NOC being provided by Health Canada. As you can see, historically, it's been around half of our submissions. This has increased a little to about 60%. There was a slight increase in 2018. I think that reflected uptake of the aligned review process, which I'll get to in a few slides from now. But still hovering only at around half of our submissions coming in pre-NOC. And bear in mind, this includes any submission received right up to NOC, so it could even be submissions received 1 week before an NOC, which, as you can imagine, is not going to increase the delay to access for anyone. So a bit about the aligned review process. It's really collaboration with Health Canada, between CADTH, Health Canada, but also INESS as the other major HTA body within Canada. The process for aligned review was launched in 2018. And I think really it revolves around providing informed consent for information sharing between the HTA agencies and the regulator. But a key part of it is also to take full advantage of the aligned review process. You would need to file pre-NOC as well. So I think the bottom is a key point for us. I showed you the level of pre-NOC submissions is about half, but not all of those are actually providing shared consent as well. So not everyone's participating truly in the fully aligned process. And in fact, only about half of the files that could potentially provide that informed consent for info sharing are doing that. So we've been asking at wherever we can, at different venues, formally and informally, about the barriers to participation. I think we're getting a good idea of what those are, but bottom line is, I think in everyone's interest, it's in everyone's interest to try and increase the uptake of the aligned reviews going forward. A couple of points about the aligned review process without going into too much detail here is that we've made a couple of changes. The first is that participating in the aligned review process has allowed us to remove the requirement for you to withdraw your file if there's any sort of issue, namely an NOD or an NON issued by Health Canada. So we're able to now keep your file in process, which prevents you having to refile with all the advance notification and the attendant fees. So we think that's a good thing. Another good thing is allowing us to share information enables us to fully include all the review information from Health Canada and their reviewers' reports within our reports and provide that to you for comment, rather than having this available after the recommendation. And then a key point is that participating in the aligned review process really helps potentially avoid delays on your part. As I said, we've put in place a couple of mechanisms to avoid delaying reviews, but really this requires participation in the aligned review process to make sure that you have your best opportunity of avoiding any sort of delay or suspension if there are any reviews, any issues during the review process. So just a review of approximately the last year in terms of what we've done in terms of updates to our programs. We updated the call for clinical experts, expanded that from PCoder to CDR back in January. We instituted a new process for having panels of experts provide input during the review process in February. And we also have a new process for striking panels of experts after a recommendation is finished to provide implementation advice to drug plans. That was done in February as well. We updated the fee guidelines in March to really take into account some inflationary increases that we had been overdue for inclusion. In April, we instituted a new process to, I think Brent mentioned this earlier, to allow for an additional embargo and revision review process when there's substantial changes to a recommendation. In May, we discontinued the abbreviated review process for biosimilars. And also in May, we revised the redaction process to occur right at the end of the review, really just an efficiency change there. We've also updated in the interim the clinical review templates for our reviews. In July, the CDIC functions were transferred into the PCoder program and will be going live in a few months from now. Also in July, we revised, as I mentioned earlier, the withdrawal process for NODs and NOCs to avoid you having to withdraw if you participate in the aligned review process. And finally, in August, we went ahead with some consultations, public consultations on some potential future changes to the programs. So just a note, Brent mentioned this earlier, but as of January, we will no longer be redacting any conflict of interest information from input received from patient groups and registered clinician input as well. And that's really in the spirit of our initiatives around improving transparency.
Okay, we'll take just a very quick pause there, just to any clarifications, burning questions. Hopefully we'll be able to answer most of those at the end. Trevor used a lot of acronyms, so hopefully you understood what all those acronyms were. There'll be a test at the end. All good? Okay, let's keep going. Oh, good, there is one.
Hi there, Bonnie Cam from Janssen. Just a quick question with regards to the alignment process. Earlier this year, you mentioned a new process with the transition of CDIC into the PCoder review. Will that process be played out as described, or is that part of your new transformation?
Heather, do you want to take a crack at that, or Trent?
Well, I guess, what do you mean, as described, or?
Well, right now there's a process right now, as I understand it, where there's an opportunity for a treatment algorithm to be developed by the PCoder, and then that kind of evolves in addition to your regular recommendation piece. So I understand that that process initiated in July, and the new files going in would be subject to that new process. So with the change in the streamlining, is that going to continue on, or is that going to also evolve?
So at this point, it's continuing on, and that's one of the areas we need to look at a little bit more closely as to whether we would make any changes to that process. We haven't done anything at this stage. It's continuing as it was announced previously, and as this work proceeds, I think we'll just have to see whether we keep things as status quo or if we need to make some changes going forward.
And a second question, in terms of the clinician input, recently PCoder had broadened the definition of clinician to go beyond just physician. So in terms of pharmacists and other health practitioners who would be providing input. So in terms of the broader clinician input, would that scope also include other healthcare professionals?
Yeah, it would. I think the key thing for us is our preference that they work through associations and societies and provide more group input as opposed to individual input. But I don't see if there's a pharmacist or a nurse practitioner or whomever that has input into our review process. We would accept that as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so just an update on the consultations that we sent out in August. So there were three key proposals there. The first was to revise the Category 1 requirements for submissions for a CADTH review to include essentially a systematic review of some sort of clinical review from the sponsor, inclusion of a budget impact analysis, inclusion of CSRs. Right now they're optional. Finally, and then finally providing complete information on the current reimbursement status of comparators. That was one part of it. The second was looking at, I guess, streamlining the reassessment framework, so coming up with a cohesive approach framework for reassessment work at CADTH, and then enhancing transparency of CADTH reports. Really, this came down to a proposal to eliminate the need to redact CADTH reports. So we got 28 responses from a variety of stakeholders, including industry and their representatives, as well as government. And we have prepared a detailed summary, and we're proposing, discussing internal steps on how we might proceed, and once we have made a decision, can share that publicly. So just a recap of the type of feedback that we receive for each of these proposals. For the Category 1 proposal, really no major concerns, except for some potential concerns around additional expense and burden on behalf of the sponsor. Reassessment framework, again, no major objections, particularly from industry, from the industry side. A lot of interest in the potential pathway or mechanism for tying recommendations to conditional collection of real-world evidence and conditional listing, which we have not formally launched, but is part of the proposed framework. And then lastly, the enhancement of transparency, generally support across the board, but quite a lot of resistance in terms of industry representation. So just a heads up on some pending revisions to our economic requirements. We're not sure exactly what date they'll be put in place, but we're targeting right now February of the new year. A summary of those updated requirements is on the slide. Briefly, we're going to require that the base case must reflect the Health Canada approved indication for all submissions. So this will be a change for PCoder and the oncology submissions. Also, we'll require a pan-Canadian BIA for all submissions. So this will be a change for the CDR side, where there is currently no requirement for a BIA. And then a couple of technical points. We prefer that the models be programmed in Excel and fully accessible. Also, ideally have a runtime of less than 8 hours. And probabilistic analyses, of course, the standard now, and need to be stable. And we're providing this notification now to give you sufficient time to prepare for the new requirements. And we'll provide, obviously, more detail prior to us launching them. And then just a final note is to let you know, as ever, we are available to be approached and discuss any potential deviations or departures from our economic requirements. We're also launching, if you notice in the last Pharmaceutical Reviews update, we're launching an expanded tailored review process to capture certain categories of product where it makes sense to have a streamlined review process. So simplified requirements, a lower fee, and ideally making this more efficient for everyone involved, including yourselves. Again, as always, we'd prefer if you approach us with all the information filled out on the form, and then we'll probably look to make a case-by-case decision on which products are eligible, because as you can appreciate, historically this has been a bit of a gray area, but as I said, we are intending to expand the number of products that go through a tailored review. I guess one key point here is that the take-home here is probably that it won't require a cost-utility analysis necessarily, so hopefully that will be good news. Expansion of therapeutic reviews. So as I mentioned, we did a consultation on a new therapeutic review framework. We are actually now expanding our therapeutic review offerings beyond non-oncology to include oncology topics and files as well. And the first of these oncology-related therapeutic reviews is underway right now, and you can find details on our website. So just a reminder again about economics. We have noticed that there's been quite a remarkable increase in the number of files that we've had issues with of one sort or another related specifically to the economics. So just a couple of reminders there is to please ensure that the model is technically sound and particularly free of errors before you submit it to us. A reminder again, if the economic reports could reflect the submitted model, that would be fantastic. And again, please familiarize yourselves, if you're a sponsor or submitting to CADTH, with the economic requirements, particularly the latest version and the updated economic requirements before filing your submission. And final reminder is, someone said this is the part where we wag our finger, but we have to apparently remind you, please do not send samples of your product to the CADTH office. We are an office, a workplace. We do have healthcare professionals, but we do not accept samples of any products, and no bodily fluid samples either. The other reminders are there. I'm not actually going to go through all of them. Just a reminder, if you're ever in doubt on the latest content, please go to the website. It has the latest information, including all the templates that you need. And a final plug, I guess, for the Align process. Right now, it is optional to participate in information sharing with ourselves, Health Canada, and INS, but we'd like to see increased uptake of that in everyone's interest. So I'd encourage you to talk to your peers and avail yourselves of that opportunity so that we can keep it optional.
Okay, we're about to head into some rapid-fire presentations on some new products. So just an opportunity, any burning questions at this point on the alignment? Or, like I said, you can save those for the open forum. Okay, well, let's jump right in.
Okay, so I'll do the first of the new initiatives that we're launching, which is plasma-related review process. Basically, this is formalizing an informal collaboration we've had with CBS for some years. And we'll really institute, or we've launched a new interim process for reviewing certain products with CBS, while the PTs discuss how and whether to update the review processes for products that are used to treat blood disorders. The objectives are up there, but really it is, by and large, an efficiency initiative, as well as leveraging some of the well-established, timely and transparent review processes that CADTH has in place. Products that are in scope, really, I think if you have any doubt about whether your product's in scope, I'd encourage you to contact us and discuss it with us. But in broad strokes, up on the screen, you'll see really what's eligible for this interim process versus what is not. And if you go to our website, you will see we have released an initial guidance document which describes this review process in brief. The bottom line is it really reflects the current CDR process, and again, that's, as I said, leveraging the collaborative work we've done through CDR, collaborating with CBS previously. And of note, there will be a new subcommittee of CDAC called CPEC, which will issue the recommendations for these products.
All right, perfect. So another new acronym for you, CPEC. We'll now move to cell and gene therapy reviews. Heather Logan.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining today. So I've got two initiatives to talk to you about. One is cell and gene therapy. So as many of you in the room will know, we have had experience now at CADTH and at NS with two chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy submissions. The first is, the hardest part of all of my slides is to get these names right. Tisagen Lecucel and Axicabtagene Cilta-cel, so Novartis's Kymriah product and Gilead's Yescarta product. Their submissions and recommendations were released in January of 2019 and August of 2019, respectively. As you know, a year ago, almost today, we sat together and we had talked about the decision to review these products through the medical devices and clinical interventions portfolio at CADTH. And that was a terrific experience. It gave us the ability to work directly with the manufacturers, to talk through a really innovative and disruptive therapy, to implement some discussions around implementation and ethics, which would have been in addition to what goes through a normal drug review process. And that was a very positive experience for those reasons, but it also gave us the opportunity to release our recommendations simultaneously with an S. And we talked through the whole process about our process, not about the data, obviously, but about the process, and we're able to align our funding recommendations, which were distinct for Quebec and for the rest of Canada, together on the same day. We know, though, however, that there is a very large volume of cell and gene therapies coming through the system. So this morning I looked on clinicaltrials.gov, and depending on how you enter your search criteria, anywhere from 500 to 800 CAR T-cell therapies and over 4,000 gene therapies. So there's a lot of these coming, and we were really excited today to be able to let you know that we're continuing on that path of excellence and innovation and introducing an interim process for cell and gene therapies. So, determining eligibility. We do anticipate that the majority of cell and gene therapies will be reviewed through this new single drug review process that Trevor and Brent have both spoken to. However, in some selected circumstances, there may be products that pose unique issues, distinct implementation issues that require a really deep dive that we wouldn't have the ability to do in a 180-day drug review process. So if they have characteristics that are not well suited to that single drug technology review process, they can still go through the clinical interventions team for review. CADTH will make that determination based on an approved eligibility request form, which is a combination of forms you've already seen on our website. So we're not really introducing a lot of new information for you to submit, but there will be additional questions to answer as part of your interaction with CADTH. We have undertaken an internal review now, having had these two experiences with the first two products, and established this novel process for the review of cell and gene therapies. It leverages really the best of both programs. We learned a tremendous amount, again, working with patients and the manufacturer, now sponsor, through the first two processes, and so we're leveraging all of those processes and putting them into this interim process. On the drug side, as you know very, very well, we have firm performance targets and well-established methods for conducting reviews and issuing recommendations, and on the devices side, it gave us the ability to really do that deep dive into ethics and implementation, and those two things we will continue to advance. So what's new in this new interim process? There will be new additional requirements to facilitate faster access. So if we understand and integrate into the process discussion about implementation, so information you submit to us, we can then support the discussion that happens at the jurisdictional level. So once recommendations are released, that implementation actually on the ground can happen faster. Sponsors will now be required to complete a template to describe key aspects of their plan for implementation. And as many of you know, as part of the ongoing consultation and innovation at CADTH, we are moving to reduce any redactions in any of our documents. This will be one area where this information will be kept confidential. So we are also introducing a specific fee. If you were here a year ago or followed this, you'll know for the first two therapies that were submitted, we did not charge the manufacturer or sponsor a fee. Given the volume of them coming, I'm sure you can anticipate that wouldn't be a permanent situation. And so we are introducing a new fee structure, and it's for Schedule E, and it's $108,000 for that submission, given the additional features of the review beyond a typical drug review. So next steps, we will be releasing, obviously, process documentation very, very soon, the revised fee schedule, and this new eligibility form online, so you can see the kind of information that is required. And if you are a sponsor that has a file coming through in the interim or the near future, please feel free to reach out. And if the questions, once these process documentation does not answer your questions, please feel free to reach out to the team and we'll give you the information you need. Do you want me to go on to the next? Okay. So the other initiative that I've been involved with is the Biosimilars Consultation. So the concept of a national consultation, many of you who were involved in that process said, why now? We have 2 provinces that already have policies, and there is talk of other provinces being interested, obviously, in exploring what makes sense in their jurisdiction. So why now? Why not? In fact, the discussion to do this consultation started over a year ago, so it isn't necessarily new. We just finally had the funding and the support to move forward. Agreement was provided to CADTH by the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance in July of this year, and so we began our plans in August of this year. And the objective of this consultation, which is purely bounded by a consultation, we have no mandate to implement or to act, unlike the PCoder initiative, which actually had an implementation plan, and that was the Initiative for Oncology Biosimilars. So our objective in the consultation was to provide a mechanism for stakeholders to provide input to jurisdictions directly who may be exploring options, obviously to ensure a competitive and sustainable market for both innovator and biosimilar companies and products, to increase the use appropriately of biosimilars and reduce the overall cost burden so that those savings can create headroom for the very thing, for example, that I spoke to just before this, CAR-T cells, gene therapies, and other advances in the system. We established an advisory committee that was comprised of representatives of patient groups, clinical associations, as well as some of the jurisdictions, and these are the organizations that were represented on that advisory committee. They've met twice so far. They'll meet again once we've got the final report and at the very end so they can help guide us in our process. In terms of the consultation components, there are 3. The first were a set of key informant interviews. We had committed at CADTH to do 20. We did 26. And in fact, because associations have members, we reached 35 different companies, associations, and groups. So that work is now complete. We held an in-person consultation a week ago today. We had 104 people there in the morning and 81 in the afternoon. And why the difference, you might ask? We deliberately invited the pharmaceutical industry, group purchasing organizations, and private insurers into the morning. In the afternoon, the discussion was led by clinicians and patients, and so there was a smaller number in the afternoon. We are writing a report now, and we expect an online consultation to start, and that's the 3rd component. So, in terms of next steps, in-person consultation report is being drafted now. The online consultation will start on or about December the 9th and will run until January the 8th. So you'll have the full consultation report. Any organization is able to submit information or response to the consultation. Not individuals, but organizations can. We will consolidate all stakeholder input from those 3 components and submit that to the jurisdictions by January 31st, 2020. And that would be the end of my comments. Thank you.
Okay, burning questions on plasma reviews, gene therapies, CAR-T, biosimilars. Seeing none online and in here, we'll move right then into deliberative frameworks. Nicole. By the way, for those of you who don't know Nicole, Nicole's the latest addition to the CADTH executive team. She came to us from Cancer Care Ontario this year. She's our chief scientist and heads our evidence standards directorate at CADTH.
Thanks very much, and nice to see everybody this afternoon. So we're going to talk a little bit about deliberative frameworks, and I will try not to use the word alignment because I don't have a loonie with me, so poor Trevor. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was, so what do we actually do at these expert committees? I mean, there's a whole bunch of data that you submit, that we review, that we provide, and so there's a mechanism and a process by which we actually review the products and technologies that go through the process and to provide a recommendation at the end. And so how do we weigh these? How do we consider these? And what are the sort of set of coordinated activities required to do so? So at this time, along with the alignment process, we thought that this is a nice opportunity to think about the deliberation process, given the fact that we have a number of expert committees. We have 3 that we can actually start to think about, are there opportunities to align some of these processes? So why examine deliberative processes, in terms of decision accountability, in terms of transparency, ensure that we're doing the right kind of work and that we actually reflect the work and the input that we receive, and then also improve consistency across the decision-making process. So as mentioned, CADTH has 3 expert committees, expert review committees, whether they be oncology, non-oncology, and then also devices and a clinical interventions group. And these deliberations occur at key meetings at regular intervals throughout the year for each of the products that actually are being submitted by the sponsor and or other stakeholders to our committees. The three committees share a number of similarities in terms of the work that they review and in terms of the kinds of attributes that they consider. We all consider clinical efficacy and safety, economics, implementation, and patient input. Hear a little bit more about patient input in a later set of slides. But there are also some differences, and for those folks who were here at the earlier session this morning for devices and clinical interventions, we heard that there are other things such as ethics, other sort of implementation pieces that are included, legal, perhaps even environmental, could even be potentially cultural. So our objective in this case was to look at the deliberative processes and frameworks that we're currently using across the three committees and help identify opportunities for improvement. So this will help us, from an internal review process, and we're reviewing all of the committees. I've had the opportunity to sit on all committees throughout my 5 months at CADTH, and understand the way that the process works and understand how the deliberation itself works. And we're not only then sitting at each of the committees themselves, but we're reviewing the literature and looking at best practices. Brian indicated that the Health Technology International Global Policy Forum is looking at deliberative processes, so this is a common kind of issue for all of the health technology agencies to start to look at how can we do this with best practices. And we're also participating as well, Brian mentioned earlier, about with the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science, CEARS, and looking at the quality of decision making, and they're actually conducting work with all the HTA agencies to do some benchmarking. And so what are all the committees doing, and similarities and differences, and what's the quality of the work that they're doing. And as mentioned, the Global Policy Forum. So this is CEARS. This is sort of their mandate, and one of the things that they're looking at, as Brian already indicated, is across health technology agencies, what are they how is the deliberative process and what's the quality of the deliberative process? So we've actually leveraged and worked together with them, and across all three committees we'll be doing a quality assessment. And we had our first one last week with PERC, and then the next two will be coming up the first week of December. And then this is some of the work that they have been doing to think about across all the HTA agencies, and because we want to play in the space of other groups that do similar work to ourselves. In terms of decision-making framework, 64% of agencies had a formally defined or codified way of doing this. 55% of agencies undertake formal assessments to look at the quality of their data or the quality of their process and framework, and there's better ways, or believe that there are ways of doing this, 64%. And then improving the quality of decision making, 82% of agencies believe that they should be improving the quality of the work that they do, and hence the reason for doing this deliberative review. I'm stuck. Oh, there we are. Okay, and then this mentioned as well, so this is happening in January 2020, which is our Global Policy Forum, where a number of HTA agencies will be getting together to think about best practices across the globe. And so just in terms of where are we with timeline, so currently we're actually actively doing the quality assessment with respect to the CEARS work. We're actually we'll be in the policy forum. We'll have some results from the CEARS work by February, and we'll have some recommendations as well by February 2020, and which will then go out for consultation as CADTH does. Next, keep going, all right. So real world evidence. So this is also something that we talked a little bit about from a reassessment point of view. Here's a sort of standard definition about here's real world data coming from actual clinical practice, and then from an analysis, real world evidence, looking at different kinds of opportunities to analyze data, whether it's a pragmatic trial, whether it's observational studies, epidemiological studies as well. So we're looking at having, is there a way that we should start to think about using evidence that's generated post-regulatory approval or evidence generation for looking at some of the recommendations that we do. So some barriers that we've had in the past in terms of real-world data or real-world evidence has been about managing uncertainty. So if we're uncertain in the recommendation point of view, is there an opportunity for us to start to look at, can we generate data that will help decrease the level of uncertainty? The data that's required for real-world evidence in the post-marketing space is different different than the pre-marketing space. So we're working together with Health Canada on trying to align some of the work with respect to what are the outcomes we're looking for and what are the metrics and methods required as well. And then what do we actually define as an acceptable level of uncertainty? And uncertainty can come in many aspects. It could come as clinical uncertainty, economic uncertainty, patient uncertainty. What are we asking for? What are we trying to look at? So thinking about metrics and methods and outcomes that we're considering. And then how do we do this well? Who should be doing it? All of those kinds of things are part of the discussion around real-world evidence. And then this last one, lack of knowledge and skill, that's always brought up. There's lots of people in this space who actually do this very well. And we work with a number of them as well, and there are a number of folks out there that we can liaise and collaborate with. So ongoing activities, as mentioned previously, we have a collaboration with Health Canada and NS and to look at what are the outcomes that are required and actually creating frameworks for the development of real-world evidence and to look at the strategy of putting together how do we collect data or use data from a life cycle approach as well from health technology management. So not just at the regulatory stage, but then on the post-marketing stage. And then creating some guidance documents and working closely with Health Canada on principles and expectations for both data and for evidence. There's a core real-world evidence core action team that has a number of stakeholders in place, include payers, data users, methodologists, industry, academics, and this group is actually charged with putting some strategic thinking around what kind of work do we need to know and what are our gaps that we need to fill, and also to improve some of the transparency and awareness of the work around real-world evidence. And we have our next meeting coming up, I believe it's in January. There's also, as mentioned previously, there's what's the skill or there isn't any expertise. There's a lot of expertise out there, and I'll give you an example. We've been working with Kelvin Chan on his CAN revalue work, and a number of folks in this room are also part of this work, where develop a framework for Canadian provinces to generate real-world evidence and using data to create real-world evidence around cancer drugs and funding decisions. And so there's a lot of work going on, whether it's on the policy end, whether it's on the priority setting end, whether it's on the costing end, and looking at different kinds of resources available to help do this kind of work as well, and then picking on a number of questions to actually help inform some of the work to support those activities. And then thinking about how do we assess what could this mean once we have some thoughts around checklists or frameworks or those kinds of things. Could this be an opportunity for us to build evidence, continue to build evidence beyond the regulatory approval, and then use that evidence in some sort of reassessment potentially, or can we help refine some of the funding negotiations around that? And there's a lot of other work. We're not the only ones. As mentioned, we're part of this global HTA forum, but ISPOR particularly has this transparency initiative about what should be available in terms of even posting these real-world evidence or real-world evidence data studies out there and having them similarly posted in the way that a clinical trial is posted. And so thinking a little bit around what kind of data do we need to expect and what do we want to see as well. And there's a white paper that they've currently published. So this is continued, our role is to continue collaboration with all the stakeholders, including Health Canada and NS and a number of other HTA agencies. We're all playing in the same space and all looking forward to the same sort of guidance and continued collaboration with industry. And then what is an appropriate RW and how do we collect it and where and who's responsible and governance around it. So there's a whole host of other things we're thinking about. And then make sure that we have the skill and capacity to do the work of HTAs in real-world evidence. And hopefully the CADTH or the core action team will develop some pilot projects or projects that we can start to work on to help move some of this initiative forward.
Okay, just to allow Nicole to take a breath or two, any questions on real-world evidence or deliberative frameworks? Burning questions. Nothing online yet and nothing in the room, so we'll keep going. Scientific advice.
We'll keep charging on. Okay, forward. Fantastic. And so this is the CADTH Scientific Advice Program. Some of you are aware of this program. This program provides, under the stewardship of Michelle Majumdar, provides advice to the pharmaceutical companies on clinical trial design. And usually these are evaluation plans that are being thought of perhaps typically 3 to 7 years beyond or before market authorization. And this is trials, for example, phase 2 or phase 3 trials that are prior to the initiation of pivotal trials. So this is an opportunity to work with CADTH to provide input on anything from clinical outcomes to design to health economic outcomes to other kinds of design issues around a trial. And across a number of disease sites in the oncology, non-oncology space as well. This is a voluntary, non-binding, confidential fee-for-service cost recovery project for CADTH as well. And I'll give you some of the details around the scientific advice program so far. So there are 3 different kinds of offerings that CADTH provides. So there's parallel advice between CADTH and Health Canada, and this is working together in the regulatory and post-marketing space. This includes Ines, who is there in an observer role, and then provides, again, advice on anything from trial design to outcome measures. Parallel scientific advice with CADTH and the UK, and so NICE, we've been working together with them to think a little bit around more globally, how can we actually provide the kind of scientific advice and align the scientific advice required for each of the designs of the studies, and to make it easier in terms of streamlining some of the requests and the advice provided. And then there's just advice from CADTH only. So we have a full year this year, but we're currently accepting applications for 2020. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the types and the numbers. So 24 scientific advice opportunities that we've had with 7 companies who have returned a number of different times. And it's a well-respected and well-received program, and certainly increasing in the number of ways or the number of times we've been able to provide scientific advice. Each square I had to ask means a different company. And parallel scientific advice, so we've had a number, as mentioned already, the 3 different offerings. In terms of working with NICE, we've had 3 procedures that are either completed or projects that have been completed or in the process of being completed, and then also the collaborative effort with Health Canada as well. So 2 are in progress right now and have a number of face-to-face meetings, including one this week, I think. Yes, and so just to give you an idea, they're across the board with a number of disease entities and disease sites and different groups. So 14 on non-oncology and 10 oncology, and then we've had some discussion about CAR-T, and then even a patient preference study. So this is an opportunity to think about, as you're planning your clinical trial, can you get some guidance from us across a number of diseases? And you can learn more about CADTH Scientific Advice Program at these links here.
And I would like to stress the importance of most of the international meetings that I do attend. The HTA bodies themselves, the payers, are stressing the importance of this pre-market early dialogue with HTA agencies. So typically global headquarters from your companies will try and go to 1 or more scientific advice meetings. The prime ones right now would be in Europe, between the European Medicines Agency and the European Union Network for HTA agencies. They do joint early dialogues, as well as NICE and ourselves. But there's also one offered in Germany through the GBA, and Australia and Sweden each do a little bit as well. So really important to understand in that clinical development phase the payer components of those clinical trials. Okay, so our last but not the least important, but probably our most important area would be patient engagement. So continue, Nicole.
Perfect. So thanks very much. So this is part of my team as well, as a patient engagement team. And so we heard a little bit around changes to the alignment process. That's $3 now, Trevor. 4? Oh, dear God. Okay. That's maybe a Starbucks coffee. And comment on the patient engagement piece of it, commenting on the reviews and having opportunities for other kinds of input on the reviews as well. So I wanted to let you know that, so in the fall of 2018, there was a listening exercise where we tried to understand what we wanted to understand from a patient engagement point of view. And through this exercise, we heard from a number of colleagues at CADTH, but 28 patient groups were involved to provide us how can we look at greater patient and or public involvement, community involvement in the work that we do. We already have a number of opportunities for patient input and patient stakeholders engagement, but there are other things that we can start to look at. So this committee then came up with a number of recommendations, or what we heard was that there was really, they wanted to have meaningful and respectful engagement and not just a checkbox that we've done this. We wanted to look for greater diversity in the input that we received from external stakeholders and patients and also the community. We wanted greater interaction with communities and CADTH, or with committees and CADTH researchers, and also from a governance and more involvement in a governance point of view. And then they still would like to have, in terms of being supportive, travel awards to CADTH Symposium, clear guidance on what's helpful or seen as biased, and awareness of raising of CADTH role for patient perspectives and assessments across the board. So as we do that, so we had this work then informed us to be able to put a patient and community advisory committee together. We had 10,000 hits on how people who were interested. It was a widely advertised opportunity for individuals. There were 85 formal applications, of which then the listening exercise helped inform our terms of reference and the patient engagement team activities. Out of that, we had blinded interviews with 21 individuals who met the terms of reference that we were looking for. And then now we have a committee of 12 individuals from across the country with various backgrounds, various disease or patient or public perspectives, and Indigenous perspectives as well. So these individuals are brand new to our committee, is brand new. We've had one teleconference meeting that happened in July, and then one in-person meeting that happened in mid-September. And these were really just orientation meetings to help get them acclimatized and figure out what we do, and we learn from what they do and their priorities and what they're looking for. And so we're really interested in having them advise us across programs in terms of their input. And we have a number of ongoing sessions with them and working very well together. And this committee will help us explore different approaches of what is important from a patient engagement point of view, what kind of data is important, what kind of evidence is required, and then also helping us with a transparency initiative around patient engagement as well. And really to provide a patient and public perspective of how do we move initiatives through the organization with this patient and community lens. So this adds, as mentioned, this is not in replacement of any of our public and or patient engagement opportunities. This adds to our existing approaches. We still have our patient and public members in our expert committees. We still rely on patients to provide us with input for devices and for drugs. We still continue to rely on patients to comment on stakeholder consultation. So this will, and we really much appreciate all the work that the patients and or groups do. Provide us with that information, but we'd like to even work more closely with patients and communities. And we continue to rely on individual patients to contribute to our scientific advice, the program I described earlier, and other individual projects. So there's lots of opportunity at CADTH to be involved from a patient engagement point of view, whether it is the assessments that I mentioned earlier to be as part of the expert committees, and then also stakeholder feedback as well. And fine, I was going to say just one more thing, but we're okay. In terms of, there's other opportunities as well, the CADTH Symposium. There's opportunities to attend in person, live sessions. There's actually a travel award application for patients and community members to apply for. They can provide posters or presentations. They can also be on the planning committee. And we've had 25 abstracts already submitted by the members of the community we had 25 abstracts submitted in 2019. So they also work with very, very closely with CADTH team. So we talked about now with the alignment, it's 5, HTA and optimal use projects from a devices and procedures point of view, with horizon scanning and understanding the burden or input or important issues or drivers with respect to some of the products that we create, and also the scientific advice, and then as mentioned already as part of the various expert committees. So here's where you find a link to patient engagement on our website and all opportunities that we have available. And we're really looking for the Patient and Community Advisory Council to help us even form this more fulsomely. I think that's done.
That's it. All right, well, thank you to all of the speakers. I asked them to go through the didactic portion relatively quickly, so that we could spend as much time as possible in the more interactive portion. So this is your opportunity to ask questions on anything you heard today, clarification, comment on them, or anything that you didn't hear today that you'd be interested in hearing about. So we'll do it question from the online guests and then an in-room question. I already have a number of questions from folks online, so I'll start with one of those while you're thinking up your questions to come up to the microphones. So the first question, what was the context for discontinuation of biosimilar assessments? And that comes from Lauren Regier in RX Files in Saskatchewan. Brent?
Sure. So the reason we had started doing a more tailored type of review for biosimilars, and what we were finding is that we were more or less transcribing information from the product monograph into this tailored review report. A lot of the key questions that jurisdictions were asking us, things like evidence around switching, uptake information, that evidence wasn't available at that particular point in time. So the value of those reviews really were not as great as what we saw with a number of our other products that we were doing. So we made the decision, and that was based on input from the jurisdictions who were telling us that, in some cases they may actually be delayed in negotiating on a biosimilar file because they're waiting for CADTH's recommendation to come out. I think the other part is our experts were really struggling with how do you provide a recommendation, because it's really a fairly straightforward review. So that's why we made the change. We haven't had any negative feedback as a result of making that change. And so companies can work directly, if they are bringing a biosimilar forward, directly with PCPA and begin discussions for funding through that group.
Thank you, Brent. So let's go in room. Once again, please, your name and organization.
Hi, George Wyatt, and I'm with NMR Consulting. I want to start with a comment first. I don't think I've missed any of these information sessions ever. And I have to say I have to bring compliments to the CADTH team for continuing to do all of these changes. As you know, I haven't always been complimentary towards CADTH on some things over the years. But I look at the change that's happened and the way that CADTH is responding, and I have to say thank you to that. And that goes to the leadership of you, Brian. Congratulations on a great term as president and for representing CADTH in Canada with this community and also internationally very, very well. So thank you very much on behalf of our group. I have a loony. So Trevor, I got a question on alignment. You said that there are a number of barriers. Can you talk to us a little bit about the barriers that you've seen other than the informed consent issue? We're trying all the time to talk with our clients about alignment because we have a regulatory group at NMR as well. So we're trying to put all this stuff together as much as possible. We've participated in a number of these files. And if you can give us some hints as to how we can get past these barriers to get ready even for the formal introduction in the spring, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So there's two types of alignment that gets more confusing, right?
So I'm talking about the Health Canada.
Right. So there's the internal
Yep.
alignment, and I'm not sure that should be conflated with the Health Canada
Right.
alignment. So the internal alignment ideally will have in place a new unified process for internal CADTH reviews in April. The alignment I was talking about is the alignment between INESS, CADTH, and Health Canada. I think that's what you're talking about. That's where I mentioned barriers in terms of uptake. So you probably talk to your clients to see what the barriers are. I don't think we've had too much input in terms of what the real drivers of business decisions are not to take advantage of the aligned process. But really what I think the bottom line is that a lot of sponsors are justifiably risk averse. So if something is optional in terms of exposing yourself to risk, they're choosing not to expose themselves without a distinct benefit. So the benefit that we've been explaining, there are a couple of benefits. The largest one being the potential to avoid delays to your review is not as easy to sell as saying that we'll do your review a month quicker. And that's not what we're not able to do. So I think the fact that it's optional and you're exposing yourself to risk means that I think businesses are just deciding not to take on that extra risk. So that's, I think, the main barrier. Another key issue is, though, how early you file pre-NOC. So absolutely, if you file up to 6 months in advance now of your NOC, you could come out the other end with an NOC and a recommendation at exactly the same time. Thereby, the delay between the NOC and reimbursement is effectively, or the recommendation, is 0. So it's not about filing pre-NOC, it's about filing as early as you can pre-NOC. So it's about both those things. So I'll shut up over there.
Have you got any advice for us to how to overcome some of the things that you've dealt with?
Well, I think talk to people maybe that have taken advantage of the sharing, the info sharing agreement. And I think what we're finding is that as people have become exposed to it, I think it's demystifying some of the perceived risks around that. So I think there's a lot of upside, and I don't really see a lot of downside other than the fact that there's a potential risk. So yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll just mention on that, we've had great support from Pierre Sabran, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Health Products and Food Branch at Health Canada, and his entire team. They're very supportive of this integrated process or aligned process. So online, we have a question probably best for you, Heather, because it's about CDIAC, or the Cancer Drug Implementation Advisory Committee. It's from Naya Sherry from the Canadian Breast Cancer Network. I was wondering if you could provide more information regarding the absorption of CDIAC's functions into PCoder. Can you share more information on what this will entail?
Thanks very much for that question. There's lots of information we can share offline, so feel free to reach out directly. In essence, what happens is a manufacturer or sponsor will submit to PCoder. We undertake then a process of determining what an early funding algorithm might look like based on what other therapies are already being funded in that particular indication and in that line of therapy and around that particular line of therapy. We entertain a discussion with the sponsor then before the actual submission comes in to get additional information from their perspective about comparators and other features. Once the submission actually comes into CADTH, we will either establish a clinical panel to get additional input from them about how these therapies optimally would be used from their perspective, practically speaking, or we'll do a survey together with the cancer programs across the country to build that algorithm in a way that actually reflects clinical practice across the country. Our intent right now is to integrate some of those discussions into the existing process. So the Clinical Guidance Panel and PERC will have an opportunity to see that algorithm, as well as the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies Board of Directors, who then will make a decision whether they can support that and not in principle. So in theory, when the recommendation is released, jurisdictions who've had an opportunity to comment on it and help to shape that are then in a better position to be able to implement that, of course, funding permitted. So it's an integrated process right now that engages clinicians early, gives patients a chance to provide comment at the end of the process when the initial recommendation is released, so it will be publicly available. And in essence, what this process does is allow what had been and currently is through CAPCA, a process that there isn't a lot of interaction with stakeholders, now is a public, transparent opportunity for stakeholders to provide input and help to shape it. And if that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to reach out to me directly.
And just building on that, this meeting that I was at on cancer combinations, many of the oncologists who were there thought it was much more important to understand the sequencing of the therapies, the combinations, et cetera, as opposed to just understanding about the combinations. So we're hearing that from the clinical community. Let's go here.
Hi, Kim Steele from Cystic Fibrosis Canada. I do also want to extend some congratulations. Clearly, you have all been very busy, so kudos on all the work that you've done. We were part of the EDRD consultations for supplemental process, and while I saw some elements of what was discussed in that process, I didn't really see a strategy for rare diseases, or drugs for rare diseases. So I'm wondering if you could tell me how drugs for rare diseases fit into all of this.
Sure. So at this point in time, we don't have a different review process for rare diseases. That being said, we do include more clinicians in our reviews for rare diseases. There is probably, we recognize that some of the evidence that might be there to support a particular condition may not be as robust as something that has a very large number of potential patients. So our experts are really good at understanding those nuances that, you know, maybe you can't get a randomized controlled trial, or there may be some outcomes that can't be achieved through some of the material that's been submitted. So we're working with the best that we have right now. It's really the jurisdictions, provinces that are leading what's called a supplemental process for rare diseases. They're continuing on with their work. We have been engaged with them as they've moved forward through this. And I would suspect, we can't really speak on their behalf, but at some point in time they will be coming out with more information related to that review work they've been doing.
Thank you.
I'll go online here. So I think I'll take this one. This is from Christina, Lung Cancer Canada. You mentioned submissions by physicians groups. How are you identifying clinician group? Does it have to be a professional association, or can it be a group that is, for example, a medical advisory council of a patient group? Here this is part of our broader strategy on clinician engagement, and we really are focusing in on the professional societies of physicians. And if they then would want us to reach out to a group such as the Medical Advisory Council, then we would do that. However, we do want to focus in on the actual society of those clinical groups. Okay, let's go back in here. Adam.
Hi, so Adam Haynes with CADTH Canada. Nice to see some of you again. I used to work at CADTH. Great time. It really was.
Still hard to hear Adam Haynes from CADTH Canada.
It does still sound weird too, a little bit.
Can we cut his mic?
Yeah, just cut him off now. No, my question is actually going back to, it was briefly alluded to CPEC, which I'm assuming is CPEC, so Canadian Plasma, or maybe Plasma Expert Committee, or I'm not sure what that stood for exactly. But it's actually about patient representative on that group, on that committee. Will there be one?
Yes, there will be.
That's good to hear. Yeah, and it's
it'll be a subcommittee of CDAC. It'll be structured in the same way, the same terms of reference, essentially, with some extra expert members with expertise in blood disorders added to the committee. But there will be two patient representatives. Yeah.
Okay, so patient.
Public representatives. Yeah.
Okay, so public representatives.
Sorry, on the CDAC model, there'll be public representatives. Yes.
Okay. Any reason why it wouldn't be patient-specific representatives?
They could be both. But I think we'll use the CDAC model in that some of the diseases and disorders that will come through that process will be extremely varied. So it'll be difficult to recruit, I think, patients who have experienced, particularly rare disorders for that committee versus the public model. That makes sense?
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, and Adam, we overlap by 1 week actually. But one of the things that maybe will be part of the deliberative process, what we'll find out, right? So a number of committees have public members, other committees have patient members. Is it one better than the other, or is there a hybrid approach? We'll find that out, and that will be part of the recommendations as well.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
One of the important things we did here, and this is early on when we started having these conversations with Canadian Blood Services, CBS, was that there weren't a lot of opportunities for patient groups to be part of that review process. So we do want to have increasing opportunities for patient engagement from hemophilia groups, for example, into that review process. So that will be part of it. Okay, let's go back here. No, it's online. Let me see here. So from Karine Alul from BMS, how do you see your role evolving relative to new PMPRB guidelines? I knew that was going to come up. Who wants to deal with that? Brent, perhaps, and then Nicole?
Well, the guidelines came out on Friday, and today is Monday, so we're still digesting that information, and I think Nicole and her team and our economists will be looking at that more closely. So I think it's just too premature at this point in time to comment on what our changes may or may not be.
I have the same comment, and we're in communications.
More to follow. Jerry.
Hi, Brian. Jerry Jeffcott with 360 Public Affairs. So in keeping with the theme around PMPRB, but not about sort of what are you going to do about it per se, as you just mentioned, the guidelines came out on Thursday. There's an extensive consultation process associated with that that's going to take place between now and, I guess, the end of February, leading up to a July 2020 implementation. I think it's fair to characterize the PMPRB changes as even existential in the context of the industry. All of the industry's focus, or the vast majority of the industry's focus, is going to be on that consultation. And I'm just really concerned that there's a lot of changes that are taking place within CADTH and other places that are impinging on the industry. And I just urge you to consider a pause, perhaps, on some of the initiatives that you're pursuing at the moment while we get our heads around, and you too, how to deal with this PMPRB issue. It's going to take up a lot of our energy, and just to ensure that you're getting the kind of feedback and input, and there are no unintended consequences of sort of not getting the kind of feedback that you might want to get from the industry. I think it might be a good idea to allow a little bit of time to sort of put our time and energy there altogether to make that as workable as possible, and then maybe come back to some of these other consultations. You've got like 3 or 4 that are in the same time frame, and it's just going to be almost impossible, frankly, to keep up with everything. So just wanted to put that out there as a comment. Not really expecting an answer on that one, but that, and I have a quick question, if you will.
Maybe I'll do a quick response to that. Of course, we can't just stop doing changes and consultations, but what we will do is we'll ensure that we deal with IMC and Biotech Canada, so that if there are some significant challenges or you require an extension on a particular consultation and looking at the entire system, the changes are going to be even more, of course, because we're waiting to see what's going to happen within PharmaCare and Canadian Drug Agency, and the mandate letter of our new health minister and the priorities of the collective governments in Canada in that pharmaceutical space. So work will continue. We do hear you on the volume of change in this space, but things will still have to move forward.
Thanks. And just quickly, in the context of the rare disease discussion that Kim raised first, is there a potential, now that you're sort of creating one single medication review framework and then sort of different, different tiers or approaches or platforms? Streams, yeah, there's a good idea. Is it possible for there to be a rare disease stream with a rare disease expert committee with a different set of, slightly different set of submission requirements, et cetera? Would that be considered as well?
Sure. So I think, first off, we have to wait and hear what the jurisdictions have prepared with respect to their supplemental process that they had announced. How that impacts our review processes, we still need to sort through. Could we have a different stream? Yes. Would we have a different committee? I'm not entirely sure whether or not adding, we might get the same effect by augmenting some of our current committees as opposed to creating a whole new committee, because there's a lot of resources that have to be put in place to support an entirely different committee within the organization. And so, we appreciate the comments that you're raising, but again, I think it's just a bit premature for us to say for certain without knowing exactly the recommendations that jurisdictions are going to be engaging us on.
Okay, we'll go online again here, and we have, it looks like this person slipped in 2 questions. So Anar Dosa from Pacific Blue Cross. First for you, Trevor, probably any insight as to why aligned reviews is at about 50%? And then secondly, also as new data and evidence emerges, how quickly can you update your recommendation? An example being the CGM, continuous glucose monitors, or price adjustments. So perhaps Trevor first and then Brent for the second.
Well, I think I addressed the first earlier. Like, I think I gave a number of comments that would have addressed that question. And the second is we have published review processes with associated timelines. I think ideally, in an ideal world, everything would be iterative and continuous in terms of continuously updating recommendations. But we have to have some sort of process with an associated timeline, that depends on a submission from someone somewhere, and someone's paying for it. We can't keep files open ad infinitum, whatever the term is. Yeah.
And this might be a bit of a methodology question as well. I know Cochrane and others in the methodology world are looking at the concept of living systematic reviews. As new evidence comes in, they just build upon the evidence package that's there. So we'll keep an eye on what's happening in that field. Okay, let's go back to the room.
Hi, I'm Bob Bick with Kidney Cancer Canada. I just want to talk a little bit, ask a couple questions about the actual consultation process that you foresee for these changes that you're looking to make to find efficiencies in the 2 processes. Will there be face-to-face consultations with various groups? Will there be a consultation document put out? Will there be an interim report of some sort that we can comment on before changes are finalized?
So we're still working through that right now. Given that we're looking to implement April 1st, I think face-to-face for the most part would be a bit of a challenge for us. Our typical consultations, we do put out a document that outlines what the proposed changes are. And then we typically give anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for people to respond back to those consultations. But if there is some specific issues that organizations want us to address, we might be able to do that through a teleconference or something. But we're still working through the actual consultation process now.
Do you know when you're going to announce the actual shape of that process?
Probably New Year.
Yeah, probably by the end of December, we'd provide more details on the process.
Okay, so we'll effectively have about 3 months before you'd be finalizing these changes.
Well, I think the April is the target deadline, not I think for implementing it, but for having a process on the table. So whether we consult through April or finish the consultation before April is to be determined, but we'll provide more details before the end of the year.
We'll likely put the consultation out on the 24th of December, and we'll want the response by the 2nd of January. So. Just kidding, of course. Okay, we have...
Sorry, Robert, if there's key issues that you want us to look at, you can certainly send us an email or write in, and we'll take that into consideration as we work this stuff up.
And really important, a lot of this work goes through IMC and Biotech Canada. It's a great opportunity for us to have those conversations with the entire industry present, and patient groups as well through our patient committees. So here's one online. Can you share the rationale why the economic models need to reflect the Health Canada label? What about if we are pursuing a restricted funding criteria? So this comes from Aaron Phillips from AstraZeneca.
Yeah, there is a good rationale. I think when we look at broader changes to the system and how CADTH can best position itself to be aligned within that system, then requiring the base case to be the full Health Canada population is the best way to go. That said, we do allow you to provide any number of scenario analyses based on other populations. Typically, they would reflect the populations that you would consider the product should be reimbursed in. So this has been in place for a number of years on the CDR side. And as I said, the way that the environment's going in future, requiring the full Health Canada population is absolutely going to be what we need to have in place.
I'm looking over at our Director of Health Economics, Karen Lee. Are you shaking your head, or do you have anything additional to add to that?
No, I agree with what Trevor said.
Perfect. That was the test, Trevor. Okay, let's come in the room.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, CADTH team, for your presentations, your talks. I think you guys have a very difficult job in what you do. It's not easy. My name is Farida, and I'm with IBM Watson Health. My question has to do with the PMBRB guidelines. I want to acknowledge what my friend over here, the question that he brought up, because I don't think, it's very hard for me to sit over there and listen to all these process changes, knowing that there's a bigger issue here. And I don't think the normal person out there understands the news articles that have been written and the impact that these changes are going to have to Canadians, and the impact that it's going to have on all of us here. So the work that I do focuses on forward-looking medicines. We work with global pharmaceutical companies, and I do a lot of market sizing, assessments, identifying where companies need to launch medicines. And in the 3 years that I've worked at IBM Watson Health, I would say one of the projects, one of the very many projects I've had, wanted to look at Canada. And this is before the PMBRB guidelines. So I ask this question as a concerned Canadian. I don't care about my job and whatever and what I do, but as a concerned Canadian growing, I'm going to be, one day an elderly patient requiring innovative medicines, and I'm concerned that Canadians are not going to have access to the medicines they need because of these PMBRB changes. And what is CADTH, as one of the leading, regulatory agency, what are you guys doing to address this issue?
I'll go with this one. So thanks for that. I think I need to speak to that from a broader Canadian perspective, and I don't. The caveat is I don't speak on behalf of the Government of Canada or the new federal health minister or anything like that. But I will go back to 2016-ish, when the federal health minister at the time brought forward the initiative to try and promote good access to patients of medicines, promising medicines, to ensure that those medicines would be used appropriately and that they were affordable. So it was that AAA that the federal government was focused on, and they were working closely with the provinces. Our role, of course, was very much focused on ensuring that we did the reviews, provided the right evidence to promote access to the promising therapies, and to provide good information on the appropriate use. The affordability issue was focused mostly on both PCPA and through the PMPRB changes. Now, our organization is not focused on the broader PMPRB changes, other than we have been tasked to support them on the cost effectiveness side. So we will continue to do our role in providing whatever support is needed by the governments in the initiatives that they're putting forward.
That's about all I could say at this point in time without knowing exactly the priorities of the government with respect to any broader issues like pharmacare and which models they might put into place.
Do you foresee that, you know, there's going to be a reduced number of drugs coming into the market, and you're like, if we don't have drugs coming into the market, what is CADTH going to do?
Well, we're going to continue to do our job of reviewing the drugs that do come to market and the medical devices, et cetera. The question as to do I foresee drugs still coming to the market? I do. I still see drugs coming into the Canadian market. It's probably a better question for the companies here and their global affiliates and the decisions they make on which markets they intend to go in. Canada is not the only country in the world that's looking at this whole question of affordability and reference pricing. There are significant issues happening in many countries. And every time I'm in that particular country, I hear a lot of the same arguments, that investments will go down in that country, that access will be impacted. But at some point, you know, companies need to make their decisions on which countries they do want to continue to invest in.
Thank you, Brian. That was a very political answer, diplomatic.
That's all I can do.
Yeah. I encourage anyone here who wants to talk to me about it to please come and talk to me about it. I'm very interested and concerned and anxious, actually.
Okay, we'll go back online. So this one, it says for Heather. And it comes from Nancy Zorzi from Janssen. Can you further unpack the objective and impact of the biosimilar meeting output? Are there any provinces awaiting these findings? And what impact, if any, would they have on provinces that have already made decisions?
Thank you, Nancy. So 3 questions. Unpack the findings coming out of the meeting. So we're just writing the report now. I can tell you that the discussion was focused on 4 key areas, and so the report will likely mimic what we heard from stakeholders in those 4 areas. So we gave participants 4 or 5 different policy options for addressing biosimilar use and implementation in Canada. Ahead of time, we gave them the questions ahead of time, asked them to talk to people about it so they could come informed with a broader perspective from the organization and the individuals that they represent. So there will be feedback from them on those policy options that jurisdictions will be able to hear. The 3 other areas were education information. We heard a lot at the stakeholder session about the variety, the quality, the consistency or inconsistency of information that people are hearing about biosimilars, reference to biologics, and so finding a way to address that so both clinicians and patients have a solid understanding of the issues and the evidence. We had a topic on real-world evidence and post-policy implementation monitoring, and there were some diffuse but some comments that were really valuable in that particular space, so we'll reflect those. And we also had comments about reimbursement. So if a jurisdiction were to invest in biosimilars, where do those savings go and what direction or advice could the stakeholders provide jurisdictions in that regard? So the report will include commentary on those 4 major areas. Certainly the jurisdictions, to your second question about how will this be used by jurisdictions, it was the jurisdictions that approached CADTH and asked us to do this work, to have a consultation, to bring perspectives to bear. There were 17 different jurisdictional representatives in the room, including 3 assistant deputy ministers, all of whom sit on the PCPA Governing Council and 1 who's a vice chair. So they were actively in the room, participating in conversations and listening directly to what stakeholders had to say. And so they can take that away then and filter that into the conversations they're having provincially. Of course, they're autonomous in their decision making, so how they wish to use that information as a data point, a really important data point, but a data point in discussions about what kind of an approach makes sense for them is really up to the jurisdictions. But I can tell you that they were among the first to respond, to say they would attend, and they were present and active in the conversations. And your third question, I'm sorry, I can't remember.
That was it.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question.
Hi, it's Julian from Rush. So thanks for the updates, a lot of new things going on. So I just had a couple questions about the real-world evidence, the reassessment. I think I saw there was some work about potential for reassessment based on real-world evidence. Have you thought about that it wouldn't just be limited to real-world evidence, that it would be something just on additional evidence generated. As well, I saw that you're working with can revalue, that it may not just be Canadian evidence, but it would be international evidence. And then finally, some of the work that we hear about can revalue is kind of about products that have already been reviewed. But I think maybe the opportunity here is for maybe conditional access on those products with promising evidence, but may need to mitigate some of that decision uncertainty with additional evidence generated, so that at the very first recommendation, that's where it's implemented. Have you thought about that as well?
So thank you very much for that. I was beginning to think PMPRB would take over all the discussion. Happy to answer that. So just as a point of clarification, we already look at, CADTH already looks at real world data, right? Not everything that we get just comes from a randomized clinical trial. We think about health preference doesn't come from that. Often resource utilization, impact stories from the patients and the input. So we do think about different opportunities to actually involve data. And then this is now just extending it from where is the uncertainty actually exist? Does it exist in the clinical sphere, or does it exist in some of the economic parameters, or for example, some of the implementation or patient? So I think that was your first question. The second, I want to go to your third in terms of what's promising. I mean, right now thinking about, that's what our core action team is charged with as well, is how do we actually think about, is there a process up front? Do we ask for that sort of, if there's uncertainty around, let's say, the clinical space, do we start to think about how do we build evidence that then would potentially come back to the committee around that? So we're thinking about process and thinking about what kind of data is required. As you can imagine, how do we collect that data? Who does the collection? Who does the analysis? All of those kind of governance. Can we link data? Can we use Canadian, pan-Canadian data to actually put that together in actually making a decision, for example? That's all under consideration. And thinking about international, that's your second question. We're thinking about where does that information come from? And there are some endeavors to start to look at more international relationships and how do we actually generate that kind of data from standard sort of sources. So the quality of the data and what actually is appropriate, for example, from data sources.
May I just follow up? So I guess the first part, that it's not just real world evidence, I meant more in terms of like the recommendations that come out. So I guess in the current system today, I mean, we've already seen these recommendations for a few PCoder recommendations, but just in the normal traditional path, it would be a submission, and then we get the information about what kind of additional data could be useful for future decisions. But then, say that it wasn't really the right time right now. There's too much uncertainty. We need to resolve that. So kind of kick the can down the road and wait for the resubmission. So the resubmission would come maybe with that evidence that was identified in the first one. What I'm suggesting here is in that first one where there could have been deliberations about clinical benefit, that it was there, that perhaps instead of waiting for the resubmission, there's that pathway to actually enable access now to patients with that kind of framework where we're saying, okay, that evidence that we know is coming, that's the condition. We want that evidence, and we're going to reassess based on that evidence. And that reassessment may not be just real-world evidence, and it may not be just Canadian evidence, but it could be international data from clinical trial, and it could be, not just Canadian evidence.
I'll start off here with the actual definition for real-world data, and goes beyond the FDA definition and the international HTA glossary. It is data collected during the routine delivery of healthcare, and there's a note that says that this may include observational data, administrative data, research data, patient-generated data, or professional-generated data. So it already does incorporate whatever new sources of evidence are available in that assessment. Now, I think the essence of your question, though, is could we utilize that at the original decision for medications where there still are some uncertainty but promise, and perhaps a very significant unmet need from
Correct.
A patient standpoint? And would we be able to provide a conditional reimbursement recommendation while awaiting the collection of that data with the knowledge that we would do a reassessment in a period of time, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever that happens to be? So that is the model that we are looking at from a life cycle perspective. It still requires the agreement of the jurisdictions, because it'll likely involve, through PCPA, a negotiated outcomes-based managed entry agreement of some sort that indicates who would be responsible for collecting the data, what time frame we would do that reassessment, and what else might be associated with that reassessment, as well as the outcomes of that reassessment, me being expansion or contraction of the outcomes or the conditions for use of that particular medication, whether there be a need for renegotiating the price or potentially a disinvestment of that medication if it doesn't provide the value that we anticipated. So I think, did you want to add to that, Brent?
Yeah, I think like a lot of this is outlined in the consultation we put out on reassessments, basically going and looking at opportunities for the committees to provide potentially a conditional type reimbursement. And I think to what Brian mentioned, this is something we're definitely looking at. I think we still have to sort out what the right timing of that is. You mentioned the PERC recommendations that had a conditional type recommendation associated with that. We heard back from our customers that the timing was just not right at this point. And so we're continuing to work with them to see how we can potentially move forward with this, because even our committee has indicated that for a couple of files recently, they would like to move forward with a conditional type reimbursement mechanism.
I think the opportunities right now, I guess if you're targeting the February for a lot of these align, seems like a very good opportunity to try and look at some of this pathway for these medicines. And I guess the previous, from our engagements with payers as well, was that the feedback on some of those files, it may have been more about maybe not the right type of file. So it's about finding that right type of file for that pathway, that it may not be used for every single kind of submission, but maybe there's a certain type, maybe those drugs that where RCTs are infeasible, where there is a significant unmet need, and that data collection could address that. Well, we could provide the access now. But I'll stop there.
So again, that was in the reassessment document that we did put out that had a lot of those considerations in them. So the timing of when we implement that, I think we still need to work through that particular piece. It would be on a case-by-case basis. We're not looking at doing this for every single file, and we've heard quite clearly jurisdictions they don't have the bandwidth to be able to do that kind of data collection with every single recommendation that comes through. So we're trying to figure out where's the right space for this, working with Nicole's team, working with our customers, and how do we potentially move forward with implementing these types of recommendations.
And maybe just to add, in terms of, is it actual formal active data collection that we're looking for, or can we provide guidance for data that's already available? And then how do we link that potentially across administrative data sets across the provinces? So that Can Revalue project, as an example, not only is it in the oncology space, but we can learn a little bit about linking data and then what kind of data elements are available for that particular endeavor, but then also then unfold that for other disease sites, for example.
In other words, kind of stay tuned. There's still some work to happen there, but that is kind of the vision of how we would see it moving forward, and other countries as well, similarly.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. So let's go online once again. So probably Trevor for this one. With the alignment between CDR and PCoder processes, is CADTH exploring a funding algorithm for non-oncology drugs? And this comes from the Canadian Skin Patient Alliance.
It's a good question. It's something we've discussed. I'm not sure that the CDIC model as it exists in its current form and has been integrated into the PCoder process might work in an aligned universe, but I think in terms of providing additional detail in terms of where a new medication might fit into the current paradigm, there certainly is merit to that. I think we've been looking to the expert committee to provide that. So I think as it evolves, we'd have to look at whether it did make sense, if there's anything missing in terms of providing that sort of detailed implementation guidance on the non-oncology side, and what learnings we might take from the CDIC model. We could certainly look at that, or vice versa.
That's actually an interesting recommendation, and it might be for select drugs as well, all related to that implementation aspect. So great suggestion. Durhan.
Thank you very much. Durhan Wong-Rieger with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. Just kind of want to take a half a step back on all of this because I think it's really exciting and interesting to hear the kind of changes that are taking place. I think some of the direction in terms of having, as you say, things that are going to be much more available, transparent. So everything from the reviews. I think you spoke earlier about possibly having meetings in which there actually may be more observation in terms of the actual committee meetings, et cetera. I think the challenge for many of us from that patient community, as you're all saying it, is that things are moving not only moving fast, but in fact, drugs are becoming much more complex. We know that, everything from the gene therapies, et cetera. I think the process is actually becoming more complex. And some of the questions here with regard to what about, what PMPRB is suggesting and the idea that they're going to actually incorporate, some value-based assessments into their regulation of prices, I think makes it very challenging as well. Where does that fit in? Is it the fact that CADTH is now going to be doing those reviews up front? Is it both CADTH and INEST that does it? All of this becomes very difficult. I think one of the challenges for us sitting here as the patient community is that there's a huge need for patients to be really fully informed and engaged and aware. I remember back in 2001, 2003, when CDR was first coming in, we spent a lot of time and a lot of work to actually train patients on HTA. And I think we weren't the only ones, but we're probably the primary ones. I think we did that for a number of years. My question now, sort of very broadly, is who's actually going to be doing that kind of work? We get criticized a lot if we go to industry to get support for doing these kinds of trainings. We get criticized and actually declared as a conflict of interest when we get support from the companies to actually do the patient submissions. I spent a lot of time personally helping to develop a guidebook for how to do HTAs, and I've spent a lot of time going to international meetings, coming back to help people understand, et cetera, and we do not see that. I'm actually quite disappointed with the new Patient Advisory Committee because it doesn't give us anything back. So you've got people that you've brought in, you think they're a broad bunch of stakeholders that can give you good advice. Where do we get feedback? They have no mandate to actually go out and ask us anything who are here in these rooms coming to provide that information. So I'm feeling in some respects we have much more limited opportunities to actually provide the kind of feedback that's really necessary. And now we're having all these discussions around managed access. We're talking about these reassessments. We're talking about the necessity in terms of being able to collect real-world evidence and decide what evidence should go in. We're talking about the possibilities that access is going to be changing based on all that. Who is actually keeping patients aware of this and how they're going to be able to participate in this? I really feel that there's a strong need to actually think about the patient community as a legitimate component of all this, and increasingly so. And I think the question goes back to everybody is who's going to pay for this? Who's going to help to support this? I will do it as much as we can, but we're limited in terms of what our capabilities are, and we're limited in terms of what our available resources are. I remember those old days when we used to have to put up these conflict of interest slides before our presentations. I remember a few times I put up a slide that said, these are the agencies which I have no conflict of interest. And they should be. They should, because I'm doing a lot of work that's on their behalf. And I've even had CADTH, CDR, come to me and say, hey, there's nobody doing a patient submission on this drug. Can you do this? And I'm going like, really? I guess I can because we want to have it in there. But, I'm doing your work. And we want to, but nobody's so helping us. And I go back to finally on the rare disease file that's coming up. Not good enough to say, we'll wait and see what they come up with. They'll come up with something. What about the PMPRB? We'll wait and see what they come up with. The guidelines just came up. Not good enough. These are integrated processes. They're not just a line process. They're heavily integrated. And if CADTH, which is primary in terms of some of these cost assessments, is not there at the tables, helping to shape these and looking at what the requirements are going to be in order to make good decisions around what drugs are going to get access to in the rare disease spaces, what drugs are able to come in and continue to come in because they're using cost effectiveness as a tool, because they're going to be using the cost per qualities as a tool. And that's where that's coming from. Not good enough to say, okay, let's wait. So two things, right, is that You've got to be integrated into that process. Not good enough, because that'll be a passing the buck now. Hey, that wasn't us. They made those decisions. They gave it to us, and we're working with what we can. It's like you punting it over to PCPA. Hey, that's not us. We're punting them the best information. Up to them to decide what's going to be listed. Not good enough. And the other thing is, we need to be engaged, but we need to be supported to be engaged. It's been many years, almost 20 years I've been doing this, and we get zero support from the government agencies that are doing this, or from the so-called independent agencies that are government funded to do this. Not good enough.
Back to that. So a lot of really good points there, actually, Dirhan, and I really do support you on the issue of the volume of work that this means to patient groups and understanding it and their education and just the knowledge of the complexity of the situation. Some of you probably have heard me speak about this perfect storm that seems to be happening right now in the pharmaceutical space, being caused by a number of things. First is some very robust pipelines of very disruptive technologies, new drugs, innovative drugs, both from a volume perspective as well as a complexity perspective. Second is that patients are demanding early and equitable access to all of these new and so-called promising therapies. Third, the regulators are accelerating their approvals of many of these new products, again, because of the unmet need and the promise that they're offering. But that's creating challenges at many different levels, from the clinicians, patients, the payers, and ourselves, just looking at the uncertainty involved at that once the regulators have made the decision. Fourth is everybody is feeling it from a capacity perspective. We hear this a lot from the governments, the health ministries, the drug plans, that just their capacity to deal with a lot of these things administratively is being really challenged. And then lastly, and this is a global phenomenon, there really is an affordability crisis to pay for all of the different health technologies disruption that's happening in the healthcare space. So what are we doing to try and address some of that? And we've tried to address it through this health technology management approach, looking at stronger ways to engage with patient groups and clinician groups. We're looking at trying to get ahead of the technology curve through advanced horizon scanning, more scientific advice. We're looking at the life cycle approach to the assessment, not throwing it away, but looking at more pre-market, post-market, and then the whole aspect of implementation support. So we are trying to go beyond just our original mandate, which is that very scientific assessment of the evidence, to better integrating and supporting all of the pieces associated with this. So yeah, we are integrated, and we are trying to support the jurisdictions as best we can on the rare disease front. We are there to try and integrate ourselves within what PMPRB is proposing. The point that you brought up, though, about funding for patient groups and how we can better support that, that's something that I do believe we collectively need to come up with a better approach.
Well, I mean, really, Brian, and to all of you, not to, I think, take away anything from how much I think CADTH has evolved in terms of what you do in your methods. I mean, this is not the CDR of 2003 when it first came out. We recognize that. And we recognize the huge amount of work and amount of international expertise you're collecting also to stay not only ahead with the drugs, but also with the international jurisdiction. So hugely respect, I think, everything that's being done on that front. I think as we're saying is that the challenges are, I mean, just thinking about it in terms of managed access, I think as we were just talking about, where are the patients in terms of actually making the proposals in terms of what is it that should be included or not included? What are the outcome measures that actually should count or not count? What are when it's reassessed, how does that information get in? And I think that's the challenges that we're talking about, again, is that patients are left a bit to the side now. And as these get more and more complex, as we begin to go more and more into real world, and as we begin to do this more, it's a greater need, not just for the point of view that patients need to be involved, but if patients are not intimately involved, who's going to provide you with that right evidence? Who's going to be committed to doing it for you? Who's going to actually be able to agree if we get to a point of saying, sorry, that's not working, and we have to step away from it? If patients are not fully involved, the whole thing falls apart. And it just will be back to the, just the sense that, yes, there's a process going on, but we're outside of it. And I think it's not just, it's a nice to have. Patient full engagement at every single level is essential. The more this becomes nuanced and the more it becomes dependent in terms of that ability to get patients that are providing evidence at every level involved, it's never going to work unless they're fully integrated into it. So I don't think that you can even move forth in all the reforms that we're talking about. I mean, even with the biosimilars, I can guarantee you, unless patients are fully in agreement in terms of what is it that's being recommended, what is it that's being decided, you will get protests, and you'll get the wrong kinds of protests. And that's just the way it works. If we're not involved, if we're not fully informed, if we're not fully engaged, it's not going to work.
So thanks, Terhan. That's actually a great message for all of us in this room, from the sponsors out there in how you engage with patients, ensuring that the outcomes that are used in clinical trials are important to patients, from the payer perspective, from our perspective. So just a great message, and I think we'll all reflect on what you've just said. Thanks very much. Okay, we're coming down to about the last 5 minutes or so. I've got one online here. This is an interesting one from Janssen. With the proposed merger of processes of PCoder and CDR with a first in, first out prioritization, how will you ensure that drugs that are life or death, i.e. oncology in some cases, will not suffer to review a fourth in the same class of a more chronic type of illness?
So we will apply the current metrics to the reviews going forward in an aligned process. So our current metric is 180 days. And we'll continue to stick with the review being completed in 180 days or less. I'm sure Brent might have some comments on prioritization. We do not have a prioritization system at CADTH, and that reflects the wishes of the public payers. If they were to come up with a clear mechanism to prioritize drugs, we would be happy to implement that. Other than that, we can commit to finishing a review within 180 days.
I think just a couple of comments and to reflect on some of the points that Trevor had raised earlier. This question comes up over and over again around whether we will prioritize drugs. In all fairness, I think industry also needs to be at the table to figure out how we're going to prioritize, because as soon as we move one drug ahead of another company's drug in the review process, there will be a lot of pushback on that. We've seen companies time and time again not take advantage of notice of our pre-NOC submissions, and time again not take advantage of the aligned reviews with Health Canada, which we've indicated to folks will get your review done sooner. And yet there's 40 to 50% of manufacturer submissions where this does not happen. So I appreciate the question, but I think industry is as much a partner in this issue as our customers are and all of the other stakeholders. We don't hold back any life or death drugs to deal with the fourth asthma product that's come forward. We don't have a queue that we're dealing with right now. We look at getting the resources in as much as possible to support our reviews so that we hit the timelines as mandated and expected by our customers. And so I think we need to look at this a little bit more broadly than just the first in, first out versus prioritization. There's a lot of tools that people can take advantage of.
Okay, last opportunity. Any final questions? We have time for one more question. Hearing nothing, we'll move on to our wrap-up. So just a reminder, the CADTH Symposium in 2020 will be held here in Toronto at the Sheraton Centre. It's the first time we've held it in Toronto, so we're expecting probably more people at this one than we've ever had at a CADTH Symposium, likely 1,000 or more this year. So lots of interest in this symposium. Great theme for it, decision-making in an age of uncertainty, uncertainty from a political perspective in our priorities, uncertainty in some of the evidence, uncertainty in all of the different things that are happening in this scene in Canada. So with that, I would like to thank all of you online who participated from a webinar perspective, our live stream, and to all of you in the room. This isn't just an opportunity for us to share information, it's also a great opportunity for us to listen and to hear back from all of the key stakeholders. So I do thank you for your questions and your comments, and that ends our session today. So thanks very much.